Hello, YouTube, and welcome to today's episode. I'm here with Dale Allison, who's a New Testament scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary. Is that right?
That's correct.
So you could have moved and it'd be wrong and it'd be, a nightmare. But so you've recently written a book on the resurrection, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and also apologetics as well, and how various apologetic approaches, what various apologetic approaches have been to the evidence. Is there anything else that you think people should know about you and your background, though, before we kind of get into this?
Well, that question surprises me. So
It's okay.
Look, I think of myself as an historian, first of all, so maybe that's important to know. And I've spent most of my life studying early Christianity and early Judaism, but those are not my only areas of interest. I do lots of other things. For example, the book I just finished is on religious experience. It's called The Persistence of Religious Experience, and it has nothing at all to do with what we're talking about today. Absolutely nothing. So I do several things. I also wrote a book on George Harrison, in case anybody cares. And that's also totally unrelated to either this book or the one I wrote after that. So I guess I don't want to be pinned down. All right. I'm a historian, but I don't want to be just a historian.
Awesome. So I guess the first question that I sort of formally put across to you then is, what is it that prompted you to write this book, which is The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, and History, for those people who are kind of interested and might want to get it. What was your thinking? It seemed, the first few kind of pages where you introduce the book, you talk about how, this almost might be the sort of last word that you're going to have to say on it, but also, you're probably not going to reach conclusions that people are going to be satisfied with either way, things like that. Do you want to put it in your own words?
Well, certainly this is, I hope this is the last thing I ever write about this. The only reason I can see for doing something else is that somebody totally misrepresents me and I have to respond. But if you're asking why I wrote this book, I suppose there are two reasons, one proximate and one distant. So the proximate reason is that in 2005, I wrote a book called Resurrecting Jesus. It wasn't all about the resurrection, but one chapter, a 200-page chapter was, and two things happened. One is I didn't think I could deal with the subject adequately in 200 pages. And the second thing is I was really unhappy with a number of the reviews and articles that this book generated. I thought that people misunderstood me at points, and a number of apologists and conservative Christians were unhappy with me. And I thought sometimes they were unable to see what I was really saying. So I thought it would be appropriate to come back and say things more clearly and more fully, add all the stuff I've been thinking about since. So from one point of view, this is a radical update and a radical enlarging of that chapter in the book. But I suppose more importantly, this goes all the way back to high school, my interest in this subject. I was already reading when I was 16 or 17 books by Christian apologists defending the resurrection. And I wasn't impressed by any of them. But at some point, I think I was 19 years old, I read a book by a German theologian named Wolfhart Pannenberg. He wrote a book called Jesus, God, and Man, His Christology. And he has a famous section in there in which he tries to establish that Jesus rose from the dead, or to make this the most reasonable conclusion of the historical evidence. And when I read this, I was quite intrigued. I didn't know what to make of it. I wasn't quite convinced. I didn't have the tools and the knowledge then to know how to interact with him. But that sort of really got me on my way. And actually, in my first book, I have a little excursus on the resurrection. It's only 6-7 pages, something like that. And that then grew into that 200-page essay. And then that grew into this larger book. And all that by way of saying, I've been thinking about this off and on for years and years and years. I think it would be fair to say at this point over 45 years, maybe.
That's a lot longer than I've been alive. So,
Let me also add this. One of the things I'm proud of in this book is that I've not just read contemporary apologists and modern New Testament scholars, but I've tried to go back and read books from the 18th century and the 19th century and old essays that people don't write anymore. And one of the things I happily discovered is that all the good observations and ideas don't get passed down.
okay.
Often people say really smart and interesting things, and everybody forgets them or doesn't take notice. So I almost always found it useful to read as widely as possible. So this book is not just the product of my reading about recent scholarship and thinking about the problem, but also trying to take in the last maybe 300 years or so of discussion.
There was a quote I really like that you included in the start, which is from John Locke's Epistle to the Reader in his essay concerning human understanding, where he says something to the effect of, there's all these great people out there who are doing all this work, Newton and Huygens, whoever else, but it's enough for me to consider myself a kind of underlaborer in clearing the ground to knowledge. And I think you said that that's what you sort of consider your task as well in doing this book.
Yeah, and I was being honest there because this book I don't think really comes to any grand conclusions, and I'm not trying to convince a lot of people of anything. I'm just making observations and trying out arguments and wanting to contribute to the discussion. But this is not a book of grand dogmatic conclusions.
So I think before we come to sort of talk about what the evidence is and think about that, I wanted to talk about how should we come to assessing the evidence for the resurrection. So sort of, I mean, a lot of people on either side will accuse people of coming to this topic and bringing like pre-theoretic intuitions to that evidence, right? Which I think can be true, but it cuts both ways as well. So how do you think we should come to assess this evidence?
Well, I don't want to discount the notion that presuppositions are everywhere and we can't leave ourselves behind at any point. Nonetheless, I think that we are doing, or we should be doing, maybe I'll put it, no, I'll say this is what I was trying to do. I was trying to do two things. The first thing I was trying to do was approach the historical questions as much as I could as an historian. So a lot of the issues here are really purely historical issues. You can ask, is it reasonable to think that Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified by the Romans, was also buried as opposed to being left up on a cross or dumped in a criminal's pile? That's an historical question. You can also ask, is it reasonable to think that his tomb was empty, or should we regard that as a legend? So the first thing to do is to argue on common ground. That is, my arguments about Joseph of Arimathea and the empty tomb aren't arguments of a Christian. They're simply historical arguments, and they are on common ground. So what then happens is, after we look at the evidence as historians, then I think we're left with three things. We're left with stories and facts, and we say, yeah, we can accept this. And then there are other things we say, no, that's a legend, and that's late, and so on. And then there are all sorts of things that are in the, well, I don't really know. I don't know how to judge this. So once we have acted as historians and we've evaluated the data, then we have to fit all that into a narrative. And at that point, people's presuppositions really do affect how they construe the data, how they put it together. So Christians of a certain sort they're going to configure the data in a certain way that supports their ideas. Obviously, if you start out with the notion that no miracle is possible, or there is no God, or something like that, then you will configure the facts in a different way. Actually, the most interesting question is, what does a totally open-minded person, or what might a totally open-minded person, a genuine agnostic, make of the evidence once going through it? Is it possible for anybody really to think like that and be totally open-minded? Anyway, I think of this, I hope not naively, as involving two steps. And I've tried really conscientiously. Maybe I've failed a lot. I don't know. That's for others to judge. But I've tried in the historical sections to look at the arguments fairly and as objectively as possible. And at least, even if you don't agree with my conclusions, I always say, here are the arguments on both sides, or here are the arguments on all three sides, whatever it happens to be. And I try to take all the arguments seriously. So at least in theory, that's what I'd like to think I'm doing.
Mm. I think that's something I've appreciated about this book over, I mean, certainly some apologetics books on the resurrection that I've read, where they'll kind of create like a big syllogism. They'll say, well, it's either this or this or this or this. It can't be this. It can't be this. It can't be this. So the only thing that's left is the resurrection. I just find those, there's so many different theories and ways of combining things, and the certainty that they want to get to that one, that one option with, I find I find quite implausible. But I appreciate, your approach, where you're saying, well, some people think this, and quite reasonably so, but there's also, here's what I think about that. Here's a better way of maybe putting together that data. So I appreciated that writing style that you kind of bring to it. I want to ask you though, what have some of the traditional apologetic approaches been to the resurrection evidence historically?
I think it's fair to say that most traditional apologetics has tried to do two things. It's focused on the one hand on the empty tomb, and on the other hand on the appearances. So when it comes to the empty tomb, as you know, there's a traditional list of arguments for the conclusion that Jesus was buried and the tomb was empty. So the traditional apologetical maneuver is to say the tomb was empty. That's an historical fact. Then we have to explain it. And then what you do in traditional apologetics is you say, well, it's not very likely that the women went to the wrong tomb. It's not very likely that Jesus didn't die. And it's really unlikely that there was an earthquake and the earth opened up and his body fell into it, and then the earth clapped shut again, and that explains why his body was missing, or that tomb robbers stole the body. All that's very, very unlikely. So you have the empty tomb, and then the rationalistic explanations, you say those are all bad, and then you're left with, as the only good explanation, the supernatural intervention of the supreme being. And then what you do is you move on to the appearance stories, and here the strategy is twofold. There were people who thought that Jesus had appeared to them, or they had seen Jesus. Now, we all know people hallucinate, and sometimes they misperceive and so on. So how do we know, according to the apologists, that that's not what went on here? And they usually make two arguments. The first argument is that one person can hallucinate, but how do 500 hallucinate the same thing, or 12 the same thing, or the two people on the Emmaus Road? How do they see the same thing? So the argument is from collective visions, not isolated individual visions, but collective visions. And then the second thing they do is they say, well, Paul was converted by a vision, and James, the brother of Jesus, who was an unbeliever during the ministry, he was also converted. So these are people who encountered Jesus, and the encounter was so real and overwhelming that it actually converted them. As a footnote, I think the argument about James is not a good argument, because we don't know when he became a follower of Jesus, and we don't know if he did that before he saw Jesus, or had a vision or an encounter with him. We just know next to nothing about James's experience, so I don't see how to argue from that. Anyway, I think those are the two main planks, and then you try to buttress those through supporting arguments. Some people will appeal to the Shroud of Turin, for example. I have a little section on there. I'm not convinced. Actually, I really did. I tried to be open-minded about everything, not just skeptical solutions to things, but also conservative solutions to things. And I ended up with, no, I don't think the Shroud of Turin is likely to be authentic. Although I admit I don't know what the right explanation for the image is. And then they'll add other things. They'll say, well, the disciples were so down and out. They were so miserable. They were so broken that there's no way they could have come up with this message as a sort of psychological argument. Or they'll say the only way to explain how the early Christians changed Sabbath into Sunday, which, by the way, I don't think they did, but the argument is that this couldn't have happened unless Jesus had risen from the dead on Sunday morning. And then in some of the books, you'll find an appeal to the church. We just can't explain the church and all these good people and all the wonderful things that Christian folks in the churches have done down through the centuries unless Jesus has risen. But those are, I think, sort of secondary supporting props. The main two things have always been the empty tomb and the appearances.
How far back does sort of conceiving of the evidence in this way go? Is it sort of a early modern kind of phenomena? Does it exist in the medieval church? Does it exist in the early church at all?
To my knowledge, it doesn't exist in this clear form until the Enlightenment and responses to the Enlightenment. Because once you have the early deists show up, they just ridicule resurrection as nonsense, and then you get the defenders of the faith, and then this stuff,
right.
this strategy I just gave you comes out.
So before getting into the evidence, then, just the last sort of broad question is: can the historical method alone establish miracle claims? An easy one.
Oh, that's not easy. My short answer is no, but let me say more than that. So, first of all, this is going to depend on what a miracle is. I think you're going to have to define a miracle. So, for our purposes here, just one of the conventional definitions is it's something done by divine intervention or by God that is otherwise inexplicable. Okay? So when I think about this question, I break it into half. So my first question is, are there any things out there that are inexplicable? Are there any historical events that simply baffle the historian? And then secondly, if there are, can we say, oh, it must have been God who did this? So I may be wrong, but I actually think as an historian, there are things in history that for which I have no account at all. So in the book, there are at least two places where I talk about this. One is a couple of pages on Joseph of Cupertino. So Joseph was a 17th century Italian monk. And during his beatification procedure, which involved interviewing dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people who knew him, they all said, well, we saw him levitate. Okay? They all say they saw him levitate. Now, without going into the details here, I think the evidence for this is actually overwhelming. And if it were the evidence for anything else, non-supernatural, it would be a slam dunk case. Once 100 different people who knew this guy at different times and places, different sorts of people, political leaders, a pope, and so on. Once all these people agree on something, you say, well, yeah, I have no explanation for this. And the most recent skeptical explanation I read said, well, he was a really good gymnast, and he was able to sort of jump around and deceive people into thinking he was levitating. Anyway, Carlos Eyre, who's a great historian of the Reformation at Yale, says he thinks Joseph levitated because the evidence is overwhelming. The other thing in the book is a whole chapter on the appearances or visions of Mary, Mother Mary, Mary, the mother of Jesus, at Zaytun, Egypt, in a Coptic church in the late 1960s and early 70s. And without going into the details here, I'll just say we have hundreds of thousands of people literally saw this thing over a period of months. It was photographed. Muslims saw it, Christians saw it, secular people saw it, journalists saw it. And I've read the skeptical accounts. I've read the Coptic accounts. By the way, I live in New Jersey, Princeton, New Jersey. There are a lot of Coptic Christians in this area, and a number of them were in Zaytun in Cairo. in the late 60s and early 70s, and they will swear to you they saw Mother Mary. All right. So I don't know what this is. Coptic Christians will say, well, it was obviously Mary. It was investigated. There's a really fascinating story here. At the end of the day, I have no idea how to explain the data. So, but then the question becomes, do I think that Joseph levitating, if he levitated, must be a miracle, or that this light figure of light on top of the dome of St. Mary's in Zaytun, do I think this was God or Mother Mary? Actually, what I say is I have no idea. I have no explanation. Right. I actually have problems thinking that God just once in a while decided to lift Joseph off the ground for fun. It just seems weird. I think if it happened, it's got to be some occult, hidden, weird human ability. As for Zaytun, I just have no idea. But again, I haven't concluded that must be Mary or must be an act of God. So what I'm telling you here is that I think myself, again, I could be wrong, I think there are certain incredible events in history. I'll add parenthetically a couple of things in my own life, which I won't go into here, that I don't think have rational explanations. But then how do you decide the agency? I just don't know how to do it. So certainly the historian can't do this. The question is, can anybody do this? A theologian would say yes, but I think there are really profound philosophical issues here, because once you have something that's unexplained, how do you go from unexplained to God? Why don't you just say, well, we can't explain it? And leave it with that. Or maybe someday we'll understand. Or just, it could be 10 different things. We can't decide. So the short answer is no. There's my longer answer.
Yeah, I just to repeat back to you, and you can tell me how much this represents what you said there as well. It's that there's really, in your view, there's really good evidence that people sincerely report these experiences and things, and then you're sort of unsure as to what the kind of deeper explanation is behind that. It's not that, because I think some people might be thinking, oh, you're kind of saying that you think that these things happened, that a guy levitated or that Mary was, but you're saying no, you agree that the appearances, or that's what people honestly believe that they saw, but you're not necessarily committed to, God had a desire to do this, or there's some undiscovered natural phenomena or what.
No, I'm so as an historian, I feel really guilty dismissing the evidence for Joseph levitating. I actually don't know how to do it and tell a story that makes sense to me. But that's the end of it for me. It's just, I don't know. And I guess I would add to that, my worldview is so strange and open-minded that I don't have any trouble saying, well, maybe he did fly. But I know other people who would just say that doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit their worldview. It doesn't fit what they think modern science teaches, and so on. But as an historian, I'm just reporting that there are these cases where I have no explanation. By the way, the resurrection isn't one of them, which is why many of my fellow Christians aren't happy with me, because they want this, the resurrection of Jesus,
to be the paradigmatic.
They want me to say it's as good as the evidence for Joseph of Cupertino, but I can't do that. Or as good as the evidence for something truly remarkable happening in Zaytun, Egypt in 1968, 69.
So to get into the evidence about the New Testament claim then, so I suppose firstly, someone who doesn't think, Jesus existed, that there wasn't like a passion narrative and he wasn't crucified, is going to have problems with this. So firstly, I mean, what is the evidence for there being a Jesus who kind of there was this like passion narrative where he kind of suffers and he's accused of various things, and then eventually leading to his crucifixion and death?
Okay, so in the book, I don't do a very good job of dealing with the theory that Jesus was a mythical figure. I note it as a possibility and then simply dismiss it and go on. My own view is that the evidence from Paul is decisive. I think Paul knows people who knew this man, and I think he talks about him and conceives of him not only as a supernatural exalted figure, but also as a person who lived on the earth in the recent past. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that everybody who thinks that Jesus existed, to my knowledge, everybody, that is, everybody who doesn't think he's a mythical figure, thinks that he was crucified, because I suppose there's more evidence for that than absolutely anything else. It's everywhere in Paul. It's everywhere in the Gospels. It's everywhere in the non-Christian sources. So if anything is true, that is true. Now, you might be asking the question of me whether there are early narratives of Jesus's passion. My own conviction is that there probably were. The evidence, I don't compile it in this book, but I wrote a book which was published in 2010 called Constructing Jesus. And one of the things I did there was I put Paul in one column, everything he has to say about Jesus's death, Jesus's end, everything he implies about what happened, and I put it beside Mark's passion narrative. And I argued that they actually line up really well. And since I think Paul probably, well, before I say that, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul not only quotes the words of the Last Supper, but he actually says that this happened in the night in which Jesus was betrayed or handed over, paradidomi. That means he doesn't just know the words, he knows something about a narrative context. And I think the evidence that he knew a larger narrative context is really, really good. Again, because of these parallels I see between what is in Mark and what is in Paul. So I ended up concluding that the early German form critics, Rudolf Bultmann and Martin Debelius, the old early 20th century German crowd, they were correct that probably from an early time, there were stories of Jesus's end, stories of Jesus's passion, and probably even a connected narrative of some sort. Just as a footnote, by the way, in terms of human psychology, when people die, especially when they die a tragic death or a violent death, it turns out if the sociologists and psychologists study what they do, what they end up doing is focusing on the end and on the days and hours leading up to the end of the death. That's what they do initially. That's what their stories are about initially, and then later on they sort of grow backwards. And I think it's fascinating that that's actually what the form critics said. That is, the first stories were about Jesus's last days, and that's actually where the focus still in the Gospels is, and that they sort of grew backwards. It seems to me, in some really interesting, intriguing, provocative sense, that the form critics' idea of the growth of tradition actually conforms to some modern ideas about how people mourn and remember the past.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So it's sort of like supposing what our best scientific theories have to tell us about like bereavement, memories, and how people deal with that and stuff. Based on that evidence, then the structure of the Gospels is like a human account of people who are trying to figure out a real person who died, seem to match up more with that. It sort of should increase our confidence that it's a real event of some sort. It doesn't. Yeah.
So actually, it just occurred to me, there's a chapter on bereavement in this book which talks about all of this and the parallels I see between modern studies of bereavement and what's going on in the early church. And by the way, maybe this is the point to insert this. One of the things that is really interesting about the early Christians is that they have this notion that Jesus is still with them. He's there in their meetings. He's present with them where two or three are gathered, and so on. And this sense of presence actually does have its parallels in modern studies of bereavement. Tons of people who lose a spouse or a close friend will tell you, especially during the first year or so, that they often felt the overwhelming presence of this person or this individual. And I do some speculating in that chapter on bereavement as to whether maybe the early Christians' sense that Jesus was still there when they gathered actually goes back to some individuals who had this overwhelming sense of his presence, which is a psychological fact, however you explain it metaphysically. It's just a psychological fact, so anybody should be able to accept the subjective fact, however you interpret it objectively.
So the following question then from the crucifixion is, what's the evidence for the burial of Jesus? And I mean, some of these details as well do get debated often. Was Jesus buried in a tomb, or was he buried in like a mass grave of some sort? I don't think there's a lot really at stake there, I suppose, but in terms of like whether Christianity is true or atheism is true, but a lot of people are interested in it, so it'd be good to get your ideas, I guess.
Okay, so there is a huge discussion, especially I think the last 30 years ago. It was generated in part by Gerd Ludemann's work and then by John Dominic Crossan's work. And Ludemann didn't think this, but Crossan did, and he was fairly certain about this at one point. And I guess Bart Ehrman is still in this camp. So the idea is that the Romans typically, more often than not, when they crucified people, either left them up on the cross for the scavengers, or they just threw them down into a pile. And then the argument is that the gospel accounts must be legendary because they don't comport with usual Roman custom. I'm not on that side. I take the other side on this. Josephus actually does say at one point very clearly that the Jews did not leave people up on crosses, on wood, on stakes overnight because the Torah demands otherwise. There's a passage in Deuteronomy. And I'm of the opinion that if it weren't a time of war between Rome and the Jews, if it were a relatively peaceful time, the governor probably would have acceded to this desire, especially during Passover, and especially if Jesus were controversial and some people liked him. Why make things worse? Why not just let the body go down? On the same day, on Friday. I think the evidence for this is decent. We do have, as you probably know, an ossuary. I think it was discovered in the 1960s of a Jew named Jonathan, and you can go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can actually see him behind a glass case. He's on display there, but he's a crucified person. We know this because the wood and the nail are still there in his ankles. The nail was in a knot and they couldn't get it out, so they just cut the wood. Anyway, he was found in a bone box in an ossuary. So this is a crucified person, presumably crucified by Rome, and he is given a formal burial. He's in a burial box. It's also, I think, some people dispute this, but I still think it's unexpected that it's some guy named Joseph of Arimathea who is a member of the council, presumably the Sanhedrin, who does this. If you look at the other Gospels besides Mark, I think they're puzzled by this. So Matthew says, well, he was really a secret disciple, right? And John adds that too. Mark doesn't say that. And Luke just omits that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. I think they're looking at this and it's unexpected to them. Because of the conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leaders and Jesus and the Sanhedrin. So I'm not sure at all that that's something that you could expect the early Christians to make up. I also think that there's no reason to invent the story of Joseph of Arimathea. Look, the usual explanation is, well, being thrown in a pile was disgraceful, or being left on a cross was disgraceful, but being crucified was as disgraceful as it could get. And early Christians could actually end up sort of glorying in this, as you see in Paul. They could live with that disgrace. It's kind of weird for me to think, well, they could live with the crucifixion disgrace, but the burial thing, that was too much. So they had to make up a story to make sure that he wasn't disgraced. There's also something here that I toy with in the book. I'm not sure my thoughts are coherent here, but I asked myself the question, why in the Gospels is everything sort of hurried up? That is, Jesus is crucified on Friday, sometime midday. and then it's all over by night. Why does it go so quickly? If Christians were just making something up, they could easily have had Jesus on his cross alive for a week, be this heroic survivor. And by the way, that they could have put all sorts of discourses into his mouth at that point. Why is it that we don't have that? We rather have everything hurried up and Jesus buried by sundown. I think the best explanation is that Pilate probably wanted to go along, probably just didn't want to create more trouble than he already had, and said, "Fine, let him have the body." So, how much does it matter? I don't know, but it sure generated a lot of ink the last three decades, and I ended up on the conservative side of things on this one.
So the next question then is, so what is the evidence then, assuming that Jesus is buried in some sort of tomb, that there's an empty tomb?
Well, so the book that you showed earlier has small print in it, right? The print is smaller than I like, especially because I'm getting old. My eyes are okay. So I have 50 of those pages on this topic that you just asked me to summarize, right? And it's a very much pro and con. Here are the arguments against. Here are the arguments that are for. To boil it down, I really think at the end of the day, the strongest arguments against an historical empty tomb is the fact that you can find in antiquity some stories about heroes whose bodies miraculously aren't there after their death. So there's a story about Romulus, there's a story about Heracles, and then later Christians also create some stories. Yeah. I think one is about John the Baptist's father. So people did create legends about missing bodies, and I take that very seriously. I don't think the apologists have taken this argument seriously enough. They need to pay it more attention. On the other hand, what I ended up arguing is that the scales aren't perfectly evenly balanced, and they're not like this. They tip slightly in favor of the story of the empty tomb being based on some memory. And there are a couple of things here. One is
what does that, if I just pause you for a second though, sorry, what does just based on some memory mean? Do you mean as in at the time? Yeah,
okay, so I don't think anything is historical in the pure objective sense. These are all stories. They're all narratives. They're all later, but they incorporate, and many of the stories in the Gospels incorporate what I would call memory. All right, or maybe you want to call it social memory. And so when I'm looking at these stories, what I'm trying to do is figure out, at least for purposes of this book, I'm trying to figure out what plausible historical memory informs the narratives. I'm not equating the narratives with history. Right. Now, if you look at Mark's narrative and compare it to Matthew and Luke and John, I think they're not comfortable with it. So Matthew brings in this whole, I think it's a legend of the guards guarding the tomb. I think that's looking at Mark and saying, this isn't a good enough story. Somebody could have stole the body. How do we counteract that notion? Well, the Romans must have had guards there, and so we have this story. John, in John's gospel, it isn't just the women who are there, but he gets the beloved disciple and Peter there at the empty tomb on the morning. So it's not just women, it's men too. And then he adds the little detail that the clothes, the grave clothes, they were sort of folded up and put neatly to the side. It's like, it obviously wasn't a tomb robber, because the tomb robbers aren't going to do that, right? And Luke also has his own changes. He for example, gets Peter there to the tomb to confirm, to support what Mary Magdalene and other women are saying. So it's almost like they're reading Mark and saying, wow, this leaves too many questions. This leaves some problems. We better fix this narrative. We're gonna fix it. I think it's kind of like the story of the baptism of Jesus. I think it's historical. I think Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, but I don't think this made Christians happy. And so if you look at Matthew, he's got a little discourse where John says, well, you really ought to be baptizing me instead. And Mark has a voice from heaven and a dove, a sort of miracle story. And the Gospel of John has John the Baptist saying, Jesus is really bigger than I am. So what I think here is that you have a memory. John the Baptist baptized Jesus, but it doesn't quite fit everything you want it to fit. And so you develop it and expand it in certain ways. And it looks to me like Mark's story is a similar sort of thing. So I don't think it's created ex nihilo. I don't think it's purely fictional. I don't think it's created from scratch. I think it's likely to go back to the discovery of an empty tomb very soon after Jesus was crucified. All right. Now, in addition to this sort of looking to me like something early Christians didn't create because they came along and tried to repair it or fix it or make it a better story. I think at the end of the day, the apologists' argument that the earliest Christians wouldn't have made this a story about women or about Mary Magdalene. I think now this gets very complicated. I go on for pages about it, so it's not an easy thing, and you've got to answer the objections to this back and forth. But at the end of the day, I don't think that this is fictional. And by the way, at some point towards the end of this book, I said, you know what? Within the current academic climate, my conclusions are quite conservative, and I call them embarrassingly antediluvian. But they're the conclusions I came to. So, again, I might be wrong, but
it's not. It's not on the basis of the like those sorts of things, or is it on the basis, I suppose, of those sorts of details that apologists will generally, like the women's accounts are embarrassing, for example, or things like that. Does that like shift you toward like historical or away, or does it do nothing?
I don't think early Christians would have created this sort of story about their central event that featured women. And Mark's story features only women, right? I don't think so. There were women leaders in the early church, but patriarchy was alive then. And the main leaders of the church are all male. All the letter writers in the New Testament are male. The 12 disciples are male. Jesus was a male. I don't think there's any real evidence, at least from the first half of the first century, for women Christians creating stories about women or females creating fiction that stars them. Maybe you can argue that for certain portions of the Old Testament, but I don't think that's going on in the first century. So I wouldn't play the old card that women couldn't testify in court. But what I would say is that if you look at John and if you look at Luke, I do sense anxiety to get men on the scene as soon as possible. And so at the end of the day, after going through all the arguments and counter arguments, I said that the presence of the women there is more likely to be a memory than not. Okay.
Does sort of incongruence between the various accounts, what does that do for some people who are Christian specifically? The idea of trying to harmonize these things can cause a lot of problems. But how do you approach it, knowing everything you know about history and stuff? Does that
I think harmonization is ridiculous. I don't think it has any place in historical reconstruction of the Gospels. I think that Matthew is using Mark. He has some independent tradition, but I think he's primarily dependent on Mark. And you can see his editorial hand changing things, improving things, adjusting things. I think Luke Also, he's using Mark, and you can say the same thing about Luke. And I think myself, John, at least indirectly, knows the synoptics or some of them and traditions in them, and he is correcting them. So to take all of that and to try to harmonize them seems to me to be a lost cause. My own view is that David Friedrich Strauss, the great skeptic in the middle of the 19th century, in his book, Life of Jesus Critically Examined, I think that book should have been, yes, I think that book should have been the end of all harmonizing of the Gospels. One of the things he does in that book is constantly lampoons the harmonizers. And for the most part, he's on target in my judgment. So
mine has a dead spider, though. This is why I always like to get it out, because it came with a dead spider in it. And I don't know what kind of spider it is, if it's from, like some other country, or is it like venomous, or what lives in there.
Well, I can't comment on spiders. I'm afraid I'm no expert on that.
So the next question then is about resurrection appearances. And I suppose first, before this is not to be confused, again, for the audience, mostly this is, and I've gone blurry, so I'll try and, not to be confused with an explanation for the resurrection appearances, but what is the evidence that there are appearances of the resurrected Jesus?
Well, first of all, you have Paul's own firsthand testimony, and it's always possible that he was lying, but very few people think he was lying. And the tradition in Acts is somehow related to Paul, that has him again seeing Jesus. So very, very, very few people would argue that Paul didn't have a visionary experience. Paul also refers to an experience of the 12. And my own view is that Jesus appears to the 12 or to the 11 or to the 10 in Matthew and in Luke and John. The stories are very different, but I actually think they're descendants of an original story of Jesus appearing to the 12, what I would call a proto-commissioning. And I think that's independent of Paul's account. And I also don't think that the note of doubt that attends these stories is an apologetical addition. If you look at the stories of Jesus appearing to the 12, there's always the issue of doubt. And again, I think there's some sort of memory here. That is, some people within the 12, the group of Jesus's disciples, had doubts or wondered what was happening. We don't know the details. We can't fill them out. I think Thomas, doubting Thomas in John, is a sort of literary concretization of this motif, sort of embodied in a single person. But that's I don't think Christians made that up. It survives in different forms in the tradition. So I think Jesus, there's some sort of common collective experience there with the 12. There's an experience of Paul. And I think it's more likely than not that Paul's not lying when he talks about an appearance to James and an appearance to the 500. Although all you have to go on there is Paul's words. So let me say, I don't myself have any trouble. I don't think anyone should have any trouble with thinking that there were people who thought that they saw Jesus. I would include Mary Magdalene in that. Again, I don't think the story in common to Matthew and John of her seeing Jesus, I don't think that's a secondary addition. I don't think anyone should have trouble saying that there were people, Paul, Peter, James, Mary, who thought that they encountered Jesus. I don't even think that anybody should have questions about whether there was some experience when the 12 were gathered together during which some or all of them thought that they saw Jesus, or that there was some event involving 500 or thereabouts. The problem for the apologist is that these stories are really what I would call thin. We don't have thick descriptions for any of them. We don't have psychological details for them.
Right.
So if you think about the appearance of the 500, so you can say, okay, it happened. And then the question is, well, what happened? And I don't think anybody can say anything. So how many people were there? 500 is a round number, right? And did all of these people, 500 people, know Jesus really well so they could just
Right.
spot him and say that's him? Was there a receiving line? Yeah, hi, nice to see you again. Is this something in the clouds? That's I've seen
Well, my
George
friend.
Washington.
Oh, you got. I
I've
was gonna
seen
say.
George Washington in the clouds. I've seen him several times. I've seen lots of poodles in the clouds. I've seen Abraham Lincoln in the clouds. There are actually Christians today who pass around pictures of Jesus in the clouds. Um, I don't know what happened. The point is, nobody knows what happened. Was this in Galilee? Was it in the South? Was it before Pentecost? Was it after Pentecost? Was the crowd worked up by an evangelist ahead of time that they were really psyched up for the experience, or were they all morbid? And I mean, we don't know anything, nothing about this. The appearance to the 12, again, I think that we have several different versions of this experience, which means that they're all written up, they're all secondary. It's very hard to figure out the details. And really, if you're being honest, what happens if a couple of people in a group say, I see Jesus, and then a couple of other people say, well, I think I saw him too. What are the other people going to say? Nah, I didn't, or are they going to? I mean, the point is, we have a million hypotheticals. We have no way of answering them. Paul's the biggest disappointment of all, because he tells us that Jesus appeared to him. He says he saw Jesus, and he doesn't give us any details. Right now, I think the stories in Acts are derivatives of some story Paul told about himself. But if you're asking for a firsthand account from a guy who saw Jesus, we don't have it from Paul, and we actually don't have it from anybody. So these could be truly amazing, inexplicable events, all of them. Or there could be, if the rationalists were on hand, some mundane explanation for a lot of this. Or a third possibility, which nobody has ever considered. I think I'm the first to say this. Nobody's ever said, well, maybe a couple of these were genuine encounters and the rest weren't. I mean, maybe Mary and Peter really saw Jesus because they did. And maybe the 500 saw a figment of their imagination in the clouds. It's really weird how people, it's always all or nothing. They've all got to be true, or they've all got to be false. Maybe it's some mixture of things. Anyway, I say the evidence that people thought they saw Jesus is really good and really strong, but I don't think it gives the apologist what the apologist wants.
My friend Camille, who has he did his PhD in political sciences, but he's been doing a classics degree in his spare time, and he's a big fan of the cloud, so I think he feels vindicated. Perhaps if he's listening.
But there's also the strange episode of Constantine and his soldiers, which Eusebius claims to have gotten from Constantine himself, as supposedly Constantine and the soldiers saw a cross in the sky. So what was that? Is that total fiction? Or was it a cloud formation? Or was God really saying, okay, I'm on your side in this battle?
Right. Yeah. So, so in your view, then there's good evidence for these resurrection appearances. I think I'm just going to be blurry from now on. By the way, I did try to sort of sort that out, but it's not going to. So then the next question is early Christianity. What are the early? Oh, that fixed it. Putting my palm on it. What are the early creeds and confessions that we get out of Christianity, and what kind of confidence do they give us about the claims that are contained in them?
Well, look, the center there is always going to be 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. And everybody thinks that is a pre-Pauline tradition, except for the one or two people who've argued that it's a post-Pauline interpolation. And I think it's from Paul. My own view is that this probably tells us that these traditions aren't folklore, because Paul does know Peter, and he does know John. He probably knows other people who are members of the 12. He himself talks about himself and puts his own experience on the same level as theirs. He knows James. So I don't think this is folklore. I think this is probably based on, these traditions are based on real experiences. But I don't know that you can do much more with 1 Corinthians 15 than that. And by the way, I should also add that if you read the secondary literature, the scholarly literature, you'll often see these statements that deeply puzzle me. People will say, well, this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, it must have been formulated in Antioch, or it goes back to Jerusalem. Or they'll say, it was circulating before AD 35 or something. All I know is that it's pre-Pauline. I don't understand how anybody knows anything more than that. Now, in addition to the creed, if you're talking about confessional evidence, one of the things in that creed is that Jesus rose on the third day, right? And that is a really intriguing statement, because if you look at the narratives in the Gospels, they all have Jesus dying on Friday and something happening on Sunday morning. So they're 3 days, if you want to count them that way. And then, of course, there are several traditions in the Gospels, including the Passion predictions about 3 days. This is a really well-attested motif, and I think it wouldn't have entered the tradition early unless something truly interesting and remarkable had happened during the first week. I think the best explanation of that is to think that something really interesting was going on from the beginning. And I say this as opposed to David Friedrich Strauss, whom we just mentioned. If you read what he has to say about the resurrection, he will say, well, I think it must have taken several weeks, maybe even a few months, for them to come up with this idea. They must have gone off to Galilee and talked to each other and read the Hebrew Bible, and then come up with this idea that Jesus rose from the dead. My sense is that that's not likely. My sense is that whatever is going on is happening very quickly. And that's consistent with them picking up this 3-day language, which, as you know, is also in Hosea, which is in the Targum, gets referred to the resurrection. It gets put into the Passion predictions of Jesus. I think it's really early. Again, that makes me a conservative here, but I don't see any evidence at all that fits the view that the disciples were in limbo for several weeks or months. Just nothing points in that direction for me.
How early would you say, if you were to put, like kind of your best guess of kind of dates for these things?
My best guess is totally unimaginative. And as I said, embarrassingly antediluvian. I think Mary Magdalene probably showed up at the tomb. So here's how I think about it. So I think that Jesus had female followers. Jesus had some males that were itinerants and followed him around from here to there. I think among them were some women, and I don't think they were just householders who supported the movement while they were at home, and Jesus would show up once in a while and say hi. I think there are women with him on the road. And I think some of these women went with him to Jerusalem. I think this is the best explanation for the data. And then I think that if the disciples ran away, if they fled, the women did not feel themselves to be in equal danger. Again, this is a patriarchal world. This is a man's world. Jesus is a man. The 12 disciples are men. They are the inner group. I think the women probably felt safe to observe the crucifixion. And by the way, crucifixions were designed to be public displays. That is, there were supposed to be people there because they were supposed to discourage criminal behavior. You look at the guy on the cross and you say, I don't want to get crucified, so I'm not going to do this or that. So the Romans want crowds. If there were women that went up with Jesus to Jerusalem, they would have been in the crowd. And then if they had stayed for the crucifixion, they would have been interested, I think, in the burial. And if they were interested in the burial, they would have come back late, or whatever exactly happened. They would have come back later to mourn. That's what we all do. People go out to graves to mourn people, especially right after their death. I Well, anyway, it just fits. It's totally reasonable. Actually, my view is if you look at Mark, the women are there at the crucifixion, the burial, and the empty tomb. If they were there at the empty tomb, they must have been there for the burial. Otherwise, they don't know where they're supposed to go. And if they're there for the burial, they must have followed the body from the crucifixion. And it works the other way. If they're there at the crucifixion, I think they would have been there for the burial. If they're there for the burial, they would have come back to mourn later on. It just fits for me. So I don't see any reason, again, to think there's no memory at all here. I would say Mary Magdalene and another woman or some other women probably went to mourn Jesus soon after his death.
So the next question then about sort of assessing the evidence on its whole, as a whole, is, well, which parts of the evidence as a whole seem the most unhistorical?
Okay, so I'm with the crowd here. I don't have anything interesting or novel to say. It's just the obvious stuff. Matthew's guard at the tomb is a legend. It's just a legend all the way through. I can't see any early history to it. I don't see any tradition history that can be reconstructed. For all I know, it's a post-70 invention. And again, I think that the stories in Luke and John, where Jesus eats and when he is touched, I think those are apologetical additions. One of the problems Christians were faced with, one of the objections was, well, Jesus must have just been a ghost. People saw Jesus as a ghost. People see ghosts all the time. He was a ghost. And I think this is an apologetical response to that. So those are the most obvious things. But again, moving Peter and the beloved disciple to the empty tomb on Easter morning, I'm less sure or confident about that, but that sounds like an apologetical thing. All the stuff on the grave clothes in Luke and John, that sounds secondary to me. So actually what that leaves me with regard to the tombs story is it leaves me with an empty tomb, and soon thereafter probably an appearance to Mary Magdalene.
So about like other resurrection appearances, like holy ones resurrected.
So I have a whole chapter. Yeah. I have a whole chapter on that in the book, and so that's actually been a bit of an interesting controversy the last 15 years or so. 20 years or so. This is the story of the holy ones, the saints coming out of the tomb. In Matthew, the sun goes dark, and then the earth quakes, the rocks are split, and the holy ones come out. And then after Jesus rises from the dead, they go into Jerusalem, and they hang out there. So I have a chapter on this because almost everybody now thinks this is unhistorical. Tom Wright, N.T. Wright famously said, well, some things are so strange they might be true. I think that's a really bad argument. Anyway, a lot of even conservatives or even conservative evangelicals now will say, well, this isn't history. But what they'll argue then beyond that is, well, but Matthew didn't intend it to be history. What I argue in this book is that it's not historical. All the reasons for saying it's not historical are correct. But Matthew probably thought it was history. So that means that we already have one of our evangelists passing on as fact something that we can be confident is fiction, which again is not what the apologist wants to hear, but which is what I suppose the skeptic wants to hear. Anyway, so yes, I'm on board with that being fiction. I'm not sure how it came into being, but I don't think there's an historical memory there.
And then I suppose conversely, and then this is if there are people who are kind of skeptical watching, who might not, who are certainly not going to be all the way with the supernatural stuff, but what are the parts in assessing the evidence as a whole that we can be most confident of historically?
Okay, so again, to reiterate, I'm conservative here. So despite how liberal this would sound to many evangelical Christians, what I've had to say so far today, I still think that some guy named Joseph of Arimathea, probably a member of the Sanhedrin, was involved in the burial of Jesus. What kind of tomb it was, whether it was a family tomb, whether it was a temporary burial, whether it was honorable or dishonorable, those are all up for debate. But I think that basically is correct. I also think that Mary Magdalene found the tomb empty early on, and I think she had an appearance of Jesus early on, and then I think other people believed that they saw Jesus. So that would be for me stuff I'm very confident about, and I'm not dealing there with the details of any narratives. I'm just talking about the general memory that I think is embedded in the sources. But again, that's a very conservative estimate. On the other hand, I suppose I shouldn't be apologetical for this, because I hate people who say, well, that's conservative or that's liberal or whatever. All that matters is the arguments, not whether skeptics like them or conservatives like them. All that matters at the end of the day is the arguments and whether they work. And I may have judged the evidence wrongly, but I was trying to judge the evidence, not just confirm my own beliefs through historical, manipulation of things. Pretend to be a historian and then say, oh, everything agrees with what I want. That's no good.
So then when it comes to piecing together these accounts, I've maybe phrased this question a bit weird. Where do we have to fill in the gaps? What I mean by that is, what are the points where we're sort of theorizing more than looking at evidence? What are the big points that
well, look, what I just gave you is a bare bone outline. So I actually think you have to fill in the gaps absolutely everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. I may have put this in the book this way, but I think when it comes to these accounts, we're always touching the hem of the garment. We can never grab the garment. So we're always hypothesizing and projecting and trying to fill in the gaps. That's one of the reasons I disagree with the apologists. Some of the apologists have said, well, the evidence here is so strong, it's so good, that it should actually change you into a different worldview. It should force you to believe in God and so on. I don't understand that at all. I think that the evidence here is equivocal. Maurice Casey is right. Maurice Casey was not a believer, but he said, the evidence is consistent with the Christian claim, but it's also consistent with non-Christian claims about what went on. I personally think if you want to do apologetics, this is not the place to do it. The problem is Christians want to do it here because this is, theologically central. Yeah. But just because something is theologically central doesn't mean you ought to be able to prove it. I don't know what kind of proofs you'd have for the Trinity, for example. How do you prove there is a Trinity? But that's central to a lot of
I've seen some things.
You've seen some things. Okay.
There was a published paper. There was a published paper where it said that 3 was the only uncountable number given as an argument for the Trinity once, and that was one that I was a bit...
I see. Okay. Well, I remember some bad book from the 19th century that tried to prove the Trinity by looking at trees and leaves and stars and things like that. But it didn't convince me. Anyway, I personally think Christians should get used to thinking that while we can debate worldviews and while we can talk about all sorts of things, whether they're true or false or plausible, this is just not, the evidence isn't here to be leveraged in a particular direction in my judgment. So the answer to your question is I'm filling in gaps everywhere because there are gaps absolutely everywhere. So I have to tell a story. I tell my own story. I turn Mary Magdalene into a major figure. But that's my story, and I'm filling in gaps. And I'm reading between the lines because I don't know what else to do. We can't call them back from the dead and interview them, and we haven't dug up their diaries yet. And these, all the memory does occur in stories that were written to be edifying and to make a religious point. The people who were writing the Synoptics and John weren't trying to be objective historians. They weren't sitting there saying, wow, I'm going to report this even if I don't like it, or that's just not what they're doing. They're being theologians, I suppose, of a sort. So look, go back to Zaitun or go back to Joseph of Cupertino. We have tons of evidence. We have literally, I don't know, 100 testimonies from people. By the way, these testimonies that were taken by the inquisitor during the beatification process, I happen to know, I guess I'm not supposed to say anything more. They were recently photographed. I'm hoping that somebody actually who knows what they're doing, somebody who knows this ecclesiastical Latin, can go through and actually tell us finally what exactly is going on. But the older people who read these said, everybody's telling us, that this happened. So we don't have anything compared to 100 testimonies firsthand from Joseph of Cupertino, or all these people who saw the figure at Zaitun. We just don't have it. And if those two cases still leave us with gaps, if they still leave us guessing, then I don't see how the New Testament is going to force us to think A rather than B. If we think A rather than B, it will be for other reasons, in my judgment.
So that leads nicely into the next question. I mean, so Christians are obviously going to have certain commitments around the evidence. So, I mean, how should Christians come to assess the evidence, given what you've just said about it, where it stands just on its own?
So you're giving me a status I don't have, and I refuse. I have no idea what Christians should think. That's an imperative. All I can tell you is that in this book, I'm just sharing things that I've thought, things that are interesting. I'm looking at arguments, saying, I think that's a really good argument. I think that's a bad argument. I'm saying, I'm not sure what to think about this argument. I'm really having trouble deciding here. I'm not evangelistic. I'm not evangelistic in this book. I suppose I'm evangelistic about some things. We all are. That is, there are things we care about, and we'd like other people to think the same thing. But in this book, I'm not being evangelistic, and I'm not telling anyone what they should or should not think about the resurrection or the evidence for the resurrection or these narratives. One of the things I say at the beginning also, maybe this is relevant, I think I'm a sort of multiple personality. And I'm not just a Christian, a practicing Christian. I'm also a historian. I like to think that I'm hard-nosed about some things. I'm also a skeptic of some things. I'm also this person who thinks the world is filled with really weird things below the surface. And I can't put these things together in my own life. I just enjoy the constant dialogue and interchange between my inner selves and also with other people. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that. They want clear answers to everything. What they should do, I have no idea. God bless them, but it's not my place to tell them what to think. I'm just sharing some thoughts, and they can do with them what they want or ignore them entirely. The only thing I care about is that they don't grotesquely misrepresent me, which did happen last time.
So, well, I suppose, I mean, if someone were in a more sort of, maybe like more of a fundamentalist type Christian, and they might have based some of their core beliefs around that on some historical bits of evidence that you're saying, well, maybe we should be less confident about. So that might have, if that's kind of caused them to sort of think, well, maybe Christianity is just not true altogether. I mean, for a lot of Christians, that is very difficult because they're thinking, well, if you leave, there's us and them, and if you leave, you're going to go to hell and so forth. I mean, is that just not a way that you're thinking about this evidence at all? You're just more concerned with, what is the case historically, and then what happens after that is?
Yeah, so I go to a liberal Presbyterian church. I have lots and lots of friends who don't go to church at all. Most of my reading is not of theologians. I'm just not in the world you referred to now. I don't. I have written a couple of essays on hell, where I try to take the idea seriously. But I'm a happy universalist. I think God loves everybody, and in the end, I think all will be well. So I'm an optimist. I'm a universalist. I'm not worried about anybody burning in hell for an honest intellectual conclusion. That makes absolutely no sense to me at all. But I do know from emails that there are people who worry about and live in that world. All I can say is that I don't understand it very well, because I just don't live there.
So, I mean, I almost want to ask you now you've said that, because I wasn't aware that you're a universalist, about, like translating Ionias and stuff like that. But I think, okay, I'll stick on the topic and
Okay.
we'll go with, so what in your view is the most plausible non-Christian candidate explanation?
I try to be even-handed in this book. And I believe actually that Mike Licona, in his big book, if you know it, on resurrection, he's a Christian apologist. I think he's right that the narratives that are out there aren't that persuasive. So what I tried to do in this book is actually come up with a better skeptical scenario. And what I would say is this: if I were a skeptic, I wouldn't deny that Jesus was buried, because I think the evidence favors that view. And I wouldn't deny that the tomb was empty. What I would say is this: we do have evidence for tomb robbers in antiquity. We have quite a bit of literary evidence. We have epigraphical evidence for this. We know that bodies of people who died by violence, we know that parts of them were actually useful in magical recipes, or thought to be helpful, and so on. Anyway, whatever the explanation, we do know that bodies were stolen for use and profit from tombs. So what I would argue is that the body was stolen. That is, the tomb was robbed. This would explain why it was empty. This would explain why it happened at night. And this would explain why, as the Gospels agree, the stone was rolled away. If you are in a hurry, you're not going to turn around and put the stone back on the door. You're going to hightail it out of there. And if it were Joseph of Arimathea who moved the body, surely he would have moved the stone back. This was his tomb. He would have wanted it closed, and so on. So that's what I would argue. And then I would argue that Mary found this, and then perhaps as a bereavement vision, she saw Jesus. She encountered him briefly. And then I would say this. I would say, you know what? The reason they said he had been risen from the dead is because Jesus had a near expectation. That is, he lived in an eschatological universe. He thought the end was soon. And as a first century Jew of a certain sort, he thought that meant the resurrection was soon. Things would go bad, the saints would die, they would be persecuted, and then the end would come, and it would involve resurrection of the dead. So I would say maybe Mary before Peter put two and two together. If you're living in an eschatological scenario, if, as Luke 19 says, they were expecting the kingdom of God to appear immediately, if they really were, and then the tomb is empty and you see the person, then you say, oh, the resurrection of the dead has begun, or Jesus had risen from the dead. And then probably what you would do is argue social contagion or psychological contagion. Once one or two people see Jesus, then it just becomes kind of like, once it's odd. Once one person in your area sees Bigfoot, you might get several more sightings. So that's what I would do if I were if I were a skeptic. That's the view I would take, and I think that's better than. I think it's better than the other skeptical scenarios, and I know you wanted to ask me at some point about the minimal facts approach.
Well, that was the next question. So
yeah, okay. So the point is, this can take in all the minimal facts, but it can do it from a skeptical point of view. This doesn't deny the tomb was empty. It doesn't deny Jesus was buried. It doesn't deny people thought they saw Jesus. It doesn't deny that Paul had a visionary experience. It doesn't deny any of those things. It simply approaches them with a different point of view. And okay.
Awesome. Well, that could answer that one as well. So the last question that I have, and then we'll go into some Q&A if you've still got a bit of time, is How would you like to see discourse proceed in this topic, both in the academic sphere and also from different ideological groups, so Christians and atheists, namely, I suppose?
Well, I suppose in general, I'd like people to be less polemical. I've seen some especially on the internet, I've seen some really nasty stuff. I don't see any need for it. I don't like making fun of people. I don't like ridiculing people. I don't like sarcasm. Maybe there's a place for irony. But I would like people to be less dogmatic, and I would like for them, as best they can, to see other points of view and to avoid confirmation bias. Confirmation bias in this field is totally rampant. It just rules the day. You start with your conclusions and then you fit the evidence into them. That just happens for everybody. I mean, try to think of exceptions. Somebody who comes to the data and says, I got a really open mind here. I don't have anything invested in this. So what is happening is we're all cherry picking. We're all looking at the evidence, saying, well, this fits, and then you build up your case, and then you go and look at the evidence that doesn't fit, and then you blow it away. You shoot it down. So classic confirmation bias everywhere. So I'd like people to be less dogmatic and be aware of that. But here, I actually think there are subjects in this book I would like to see followed up. So one of the, I think, more interesting chapters in there is on the phenomenon of rainbow bodies in Tibetan Buddhism. And there is a tradition which is ongoing. It's continuing today. You can interview people, apparently, who claim to have witnessed this. There is a tradition of missing bodies of great and holy masters disappearing within a short period of time of death, and in a few cases, their disciples see them and they communicate with them. I think Christians really need to look at this and figure out what's going on. They need to be as they're always telling other people, what? Try to look at the evidence objectively. Try to be fair. Don't just dismiss us. They need to look at this evidence and figure out what is going on. They need to figure out in what sense this tradition is and is not a parallel. And I think whatever happens, it'll be interesting. If they decide that all of this firsthand testimony must be dismissed because it's legendary, even though it's firsthand, where does that leave you with the New Testament? On the other hand, if you decide some of these stories are incredible, what would that mean? That would obviously be, blow everybody's minds, wouldn't it? So I think, I hope that this creates some more interest in that topic. And beyond that, I think we need serious discussion. I don't know where this is going to come from, of collective visions, because if you look objectively, there are lots of collective visions, not just Marian visions, but sometimes collective visions of the recently departed. And people need to look at this. They need to study it more. I haven't given it enough attention. Maybe, the apologist argument at the end of the day will work for some of this material, and we'll say, yeah, some people, it looks like, they appeared to a group after they died. Or maybe we'll figure something else out. I really think that more serious attention needs to be given to visions, to collective visions, also to visions of Jesus down through history, and Marian visions when they are collective. There's a really interesting, fairly recent case down in Venezuela. I sure wish somebody, could go down there and interview everybody and figure out what the heck really happened. It would be instructive psychologically, sociologically, maybe paranormally. How would I know? I haven't been there. I haven't talked to the people. I don't know what happened. But we sort of shied away from this exotic material. And I think that if we're going to talk about resurrection, that we need to take seriously this other stuff. So that's one of my hopes. I'm not holding my breath, but that's one of my hopes.
Awesome. Well, thanks for those. If you've got a bit of time then, I think there are some questions from the chat.
Okay.
The first of which, Laura Robinson, who I told you about, the New Testament review one of the New Testament review podcast hosts, says, "Hi, what are your thoughts on Mark Goodacre's suggestion that the Gospels presuppose a large tomb and give directions about where to place Jesus?"
Okay, so somebody referred me to this recently, and I didn't look it up. So here's the honest answer. Somewhere in the preface to this book, I apologize for all the things I did not read. And so I did not read Mark's article on this or see his podcast or whatever it is Laura is referring to. So I don't know how to answer the question. You've simply caught me off guard here. Somebody else did too recently, and I just said I'm not familiar with the argument. If you're asking, though, if I think Mark is telling you where to go, that seems odd to me. I would have to see what his argument is there. Large tomb, maybe you're talking about benches, or maybe he's talking about benches, and maybe it looks like somebody sitting on the right, or maybe it looks like somebody sitting on the left. If this were a family tomb, if it belonged to some rich guy, Joseph of Arimathea, then it might be large. But I would add this. So I'm not really answering your question because you just caught me off guard and you're asking me about something I haven't studied. Yeah, I just lost my train of thought there.
It's all right.
Yeah, I apologize. Just lost my train of thought. Oh, I was just going to say this. I have wondered about the tomb. I think I bring this up in the book. Why is Joseph of Arimathea called Joseph of Arimathea?
Right. Yeah, I remember.
It must be because he recently came there. If he's 2 or 3 generations in, he's not Joseph of Arimathea. He's Joseph somebody else. So he must have recently arrived. So if you could accept the notion that there's a family tomb there, I did observe that it's not likely to be filled with lots of people. If he just showed up there and he bought a tomb, it probably would be relatively new or empty. So that's totally evading your question, just something that popped into my mind there. But if somebody wants to, this did come up before. Somebody asked me about this, and I just said, I don't know. So if this is an article I've missed, I would really like to know about it.
Yeah, I'm sure like Laura will probably email it over to you or something at some point. Jonathan Becker has asked, when assessing the theory that gospel stories are patterned on earlier tradition, how important is it that we be able to identify a specific source from which the story may be crafted?
Well, how important is it? All I'd say in response to this is we do the best we can. I think it's helpful to know that Matthew is using Mark and that Luke is using Mark and that John knows synoptics or synoptic tradition because you can see changes that are made. The problem, though, is with Mark, and Mark's the earliest source. And I don't know how to do anything other than say vaguely, I think there was a pre-Mark and Passion narrative. I do not then know how to do anything more on the literary level. At that point, I simply have to start trying to do history with what we have. It's the same thing for 1 Corinthians 15. It would be really nice if we could figure out what was Pauline and what's not. I personally would guess Paul added the 500. I think he added James. And I think the appearance to all the apostles is just a sort of generalizing summary. That is, he appeared to lots of other people too who have the name of apostles. But I can't show this. So what I guess I have to judge quickly to history. So this is more, maybe it's more filling in the gaps. We do the best we can, but we're filling in gaps all the time because we just don't have the sources.
Awesome. So Joseph has asked if Dale if Dale is interested in unpacking his view on universalism. I'd love to hear it. If not, appreciate you guys. I know it's a bit off.
Okay, so what I would do is I wrote a book called Night Comes, and it has a chapter on hell, and my universalism is argued for in that. that book in that chapter. So, yeah. So Joseph, buy the book. I like it. It's a good
And
book.
he says, sorry for calling you Dale when he doesn't know you personally as well.
I didn't notice. My students are starting, some of them are starting to call me Dale too. The world is changing.
And Mind Onion has asked, what methodology does he use to decide between memory and unhistorical?
I don't have a single method. I just have common sense ideas, which may not hold up. So, look, if something is attested only in a late source, I am suspicious of it. If it's attested in an early source and I find the explanations of it which appeal to fiction to be unpersuasive, then I'm favorably inclined. But I don't know that I can say a whole lot more than that. Memory here is probably social memory, because apart from Paul, we don't have anybody's firsthand memory. So we're talking about memory that's passed down within early Christian groups and gets mixed in. And I guess I should say that I think everything that has memory is mixed in with other things that aren't memory, and that often I can't make this distinction. And again, I said at one point that I actually think of some things as solidly historical or probably historical, some things as unhistorical, but there are other things I just don't know what to do with and say, oh, I'm not sure about this at all. So I wouldn't want to leave the impression that I operate with this clear dichotomy. But the other thing is, I don't think, apart from what I just said, that I operate with any particular method. I was just in a conference last week and we were talking about method, and I've written about method in historical Jesus studies and before, but it's really not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in whatever arguments you can bring to whatever it is you're looking at, and I never operate within some sort of method. I never look at a text and say, okay, here are the 4 things I'm going to do with it. 1, 2, 3, 4. That just never occurs to me. Thoughts about method are almost always rationalizations after the fact, when you're trying to justify what you already did on some unconscious level. So I'm not going to be able to tell you what the method is in the book beyond what I said to start with.
So I think there's about 3 or 4 more questions. So if we go with those, and people in the chat, if you stop at this point, and then we can just work through those.
Okay.
So Billy Pilgrim says the Gospels are unattributed and written at least 80 years after the resurrection in a different language than the illiterate apostles. How does this affect your confidence level?
Well, so you and I would have to sit down and talk about this. So the Gospels were probably originally unattributed. Whether that means nobody knew who wrote them from the beginning, I don't know. Actually, I share the view that's in Joel Marcus's commentary on Mark, that the possibility that this was written by John Mark is sort of a 50-50 thing. We can't prove it. We can't disprove it. Is a possibility. I don't know. I'm old-fashioned about the Gospel of Luke. I think the Gospel of Luke is a 1st century text. I don't think it's a 2nd century text. And I think the possibility of the traditional authorship is real. I think that Adolf Harnack and Joseph Fitzmyer had good points to make when they argued for so-called Luke being the author of Luke and Acts. But the main disagreement here probably would be date. So if Jesus died in 30, then 80 years later would be what, 110? So I think Mark is around 70. I think Matthew is 85 to 90. I argued that at length in a commentary at some point. John is the latest. I think it's around 100. Luke Acts, whether it's closer to 70 or 100, I don't know. I'm not on board with the recent attempts to make this look like a 2nd century novel. And I'm skeptical of the recent attempts to show that the author of Acts knew Josephus. So the 80 years seems too far away from me. However, the language thing is interesting. It's important. It's one reason that you always have to be cautious when you're dealing with the historical Jesus, because you never have the exact words. You already always have a translation, and that means a paraphrase into another language. And even if you accept my dating for the Gospels and earlier dating for them, that's part of the reason we have a quest for the historical Jesus. If you don't think Matthew wrote Matthew, and you don't think John wrote John, and I don't, and even if you think maybe Mark wrote Mark or Luke wrote Luke, all the questions are still open. Eyewitnesses can distort things from the beginning. You don't need 80 years to get things wrong. You can get things wrong in 30 years or 40 years or 10 years or 20 years. So I would just say that's why this quest for the historical Jesus got started in the first place, and that's why it continues. There is bad news if you want to try to be a historian of Jesus, and what we've all been trying to do for, I don't know, since Ray Morris, is see whether we can overcome the odds against us. But I agree that we can't just open these texts and read objective eyewitness accounts. So the confidence level, that's just going to depend on a million things. Obviously, given what I've said today, I have more confidence in the Gospels than, let's say, John Dominic Crossan or Bart Ehrman. On the other hand, Richard Bauckham would tell you that I'm a skeptic, and I'm to be dismissed with Rudolf Bultmann, who thought the Gospels were fiction from beginning to end. So I think I'm happily in the middle, but maybe not.
So the next question was, I mean, are you a mythicist or a historicist? I mean, I think we've sort of gone over this a little bit, but I don't know if there's more you want to say.
Well, I don't think Jesus is a myth. I think he's a historical figure. I think there was a Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. I think he had the normal stuff. I think he was an exorcist. I think he died during the time of Pontius Pilate. I think he had a brother named James. So if that makes me a historicist, then I'm an historicist. I'm not a mythicist. If by that you mean Jesus is a total myth. On the other hand, I think there are mythical elements in the Gospels. That is, there are stories there that have folk elements in them that David Friedrich Strauss would call mythical. I see barely any history, for example, in Matthew 1 and 2, Matthew's infancy narrative. Yeah, I think his parents were named Joseph and Mary, and he lived in Nazareth, and he was probably born in the reign of Herod the Great, but that's about all the history I can find behind the Magi and the star and so on. So I don't know, maybe I'm a mythicist, a semi-mythicist. I don't know.
Yokus Kavan asks, what is Arimathea, a place or what? There seem to be different theories floating around.
Okay. It's probably a place, and it's probably a really tiny, obscure place because we can't agree on its identification. Some people have used this as a reason to think that we have a myth here. I don't think that's a good reason. There must have been lots of tiny little villages that we know nothing about. So it can't have been a big place because we don't know about it. There is a theory by a scholar named Aus, who tried to derive its name from legends about Moses. I didn't find that convincing. Anyway, I found no convincing explanation of the name other than that it's probably what it seems to be. The name of a place, but we can't identify it.
Two more questions. So this one was just Trevor saying, is faith necessary to have an unbiased view of the resurrection?
Okay, I'm going to have to stare at those words to figure out what that means.
Well, I think implied in the question is that faith causes a bias that perhaps in the resurrection evidence, or maybe I'm misinterpreting that. Maybe it's that it is faith the thing that gets maybe means is faith necessary and sufficient for the resurrection? Is
It
it?
depends on what your faith is in. I mean, so if you have faith in uh, Allah, no. And then it would depend on what kind of Christian faith you're talking about. I certainly know Christians who are very liberal about the resurrection and don't need any of the stuff we've been talking about today to be historical. Dale Martin seems to me to be there or close to there. He's indifferent about the historical facts. So you actually would depend on what you mean by faith, I think. As far as unbiased view of the resurrection, that's interesting. Is there such a thing? Maybe you mean, is faith necessary to have the right view of the resurrection? I can certainly say that people of a certain religious orientation will see the resurrection in a certain way, but that's vague and unhelpful. So I'm not sure what more I can do with this.
And then, so the last question then, John asks, what's your view on the theory that the 500 in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed was a scribal error, and originally it referred to the event at Pentecost?
So that's a possibility. And actually, Gerd Ludemann at one point thought that the 500 was a reference to Pentecost. But there is, at least the way Luke tells it, no real overlap between what he relates and an appearance of Jesus. So if Luke is accurate, which of course is an open question, then there doesn't look like an appearance of Jesus there. If this is Pentecost, then it means you have a really strange and liberal idea of what an appearance of Jesus would be. People speaking in tongues, is that an appearance of Jesus? So, the language is intriguing, Pentecost, and the word for 500 in Greek. They both start with pent. But I didn't in this book. I have a long footnote on this. I didn't accept the theory. You can't dismiss it as impossible. But again, this takes you back to how little you know. Wouldn't it be nice to know what that appearance was? Wouldn't it be nice to know if this is Pentecost or it wasn't Pentecost? We're just here with touching the hem of the garment time after time, and we can't see the garment. We're just touching the edge of this history here, which is why I don't want to leverage this for. I don't want to make this too much work for Christian apologetics. I think they need to go elsewhere myself.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time in doing an interview today, in replying to a strange external email that you got as well from someone asking. If in terms of things that you have got out there, best places for people to buy books, or have you got any place that you kind of post resources to, a website or anything that you would redirect people to?
Of course not. No. No, I told you today when I signed in, it wanted me to sign in with Facebook or Google, and I don't have. I had to look at some old piece of paper to realize I had signed up for some Google thing at one point. I don't even know what it is, what it does. So no, I'm actually. The truth is, I wish to be a mystic. That's my goal in life, and so I wish to meditate and pray in silence. And actually, the more time I can get away from screens and noise and people and everything, the happier I am. So I've enjoyed this anyway. Don't get me wrong.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think there's a real problem with how a lot of these things are sort of designed to sort of hijack the way the way that we sort of function and steal our attention and monetize it for certain people and stuff. And it's very
and I have written about this recently. I really do think my attention span has been radically affected by the last 20 years or so. In my retirement, I'm considering not having email.
Right.
I don't know what'll happen.
Well, I don't know if you know who I don't know if you know who Donald Knuth is. He's a famous computer scientist. Like he's written a lot of the big algorithms and stuff. And interestingly, he's a Christian as well. He actually wrote a book called 316 on all the like 316 passages in the Bible that were famous. But yeah, he's like this big computer science guy. But he's just got this one really like rubbish HTML web page about him, and he can't be contacted by email or by it's I find it really interesting. But,
yeah, well, I have to be contacted because I have students, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. If you want to hang around for a second, it'll just play some closing credits, and then we'll be here. For everyone who's watching, if you've enjoyed, be sure to like the video, leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And also, if you think someone would benefit from the kind of topics we're talking about over here, then be sure to share it around with them so they can learn and find out more and hopefully figure out more about what's going on in the world. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
I need to find the closing credits now. There we go. Right. Thanks everyone.